It's 1540, and the farmers of Telemark are rising up in arms against their overlord. At the end of a dry summer season, I decided to visit the location of a popular revolt that ended in tears and death. That year, 100 German Saxon miners had come to extract the valuable metals from a newfound copper mine, but the mostly Catholic Norwegian community had little tolerance for the influx of Protestant foreigners. Violently, the farmers and rebels expelled the miners and their feudal overlords. But the story of 1540 does not end well for these peasants. Once they had disarmed their weapons, which consisted mostly of bows and arrows and antiquated medieval weaponry, the king, who had troops with firearms, brutally squashed the rebellion. The trials against the rebels took place in the middle of Telemark County. The rebels had deeply offended their new sovereign, and they were punished harshly. The leaders of the rebellion were actually executed on a field right next to this church here, the Field of Blood. And supposedly the farmers had to do this deed by themselves. Imagine that, having to kill your own friends, pay the king a hefty fine, and swear a bitter oath of allegiance. We do beg that His Royal Majesty, our greatest grace, will look with kindness and mercy upon our great madness and defect, so that His grace will kindly and mercifully take us under His favor and not punish us too harshly. Let's explore the twin kingdoms in the union known as Denmark-Norway. A once great royal dynasty hides among us today in plain view. Few actually remember their names or indeed pay any attention to anything about them. These were the kings of Denmark-Norway, the longest-lasting union of crowns that has ever been in Scandinavia. They ruled over a network of crown colonies, territories and dependencies, the Atlantic Islands, Greenland, Iceland, and Denmark's continental holdings, Schleswig and Holstein. A sea empire, where fishing in the north was politically joined with the extensive plantations and the slave trade of the east, west, and south. Poised in the middle of this imperialist web was the kingdom's beating heart, Copenhagen. Here, Danish kings ruled together with their lords, nobles, retinues and families. Christian, the man who had squashed the rebellion of 1540, had brought Protestantism and achieved the successful incorporation of Norway into the kingdom. His successor, Frederick, was to clash with his own nobles over the handling of foreign affairs. Christian, or Christian Quart, launched an ambitious program of building wars and colonization. Some kings and nobles saw little worth in Norway, apart from taxes and resource exploitation. Others realized the inherent potential in this land of great contrasts. The unsure footing between the nobles and their king paved the way for royal absolutism by 1660. This made the monarchs so much more powerful. They alone could decree the laws and taxes and rule an authoritarian, centralized kingdom that allowed for powerful armies, splendid architecture, palaces and fortresses, and the most awesome wigs thus seen so far up north. But the Oldenburg monarchy hid a darker, more deficient side, such as the insane and schizophrenic Christian VII. For in 1770, Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's doctor, was ceded massive de facto power over the kingdom. A commoner, a man of the Enlightenment, Struensee's reforms sought to upturn the otherwise authoritarian and conservative regime. Except nobody else was having it. Just months in, a palace coup reduced Struensee to another headless man on history's scrapyard of dead idealists. The kings ruled over a people who rarely saw interference with their way of life. Norwegians were farmers and fishermen. There were a few towns, yes, but the population was decentralized and northern regions inhabited by the Sami peoples. Also along the border with Sweden lived the so-called forest Finns, Finnish settlers who practiced a unique form of slash-and-burn agriculture. Now, the king in Copenhagen was in need of metals, resources, and Norway had plenty. Many mines were opened for large-scale exploitation, with the mining towns receiving royal privileges. Røros copper mine was opened in 1644. It became a hotbed of activity and industry, with eventually thousands of workers. All the while, to clear off debt, the king sold crown estates to the farmers. The result was that the amount of self-owning farmers increased significantly. This economic growth translated into population growth. At the dawn of the 16th century, there were about 200,000 people in Norway. By around 1650, that number had doubled. By the 1801 census, this number had again more than doubled. A new class of administrators were to take over the running of Norway, collect the taxes, lead the troops, and preach the word of God. A lack of native experts and educated men meant that a large portion of these were Danes, Germans, Dutch, and other Europeans. The more things change, the more they stay the same. These families eventually began to feel more and more like Norwegians, and this new aristocracy occupied the exact same top tier of society that was elsewhere in Europe occupied by the nobles. From the beginning of this period, the peaceful farmers of Norway and Sweden had rarely engaged one another in large-scale warfare, but this would change. During the 17th century, the antagonism between the Oldenburgs and the Swedish warrior kings was ramped up. Count Hannibal Sehested, Stattholder of Norway, had begun arming a militia. The idea was to distract the Swedish war efforts away from Denmark, along the border in Norway. The situation was dark and precarious, and the country was under threat of being swallowed piecemeal by the enemy. The king had realized the importance of Norway, and his men began recruiting an army. This new army would grow during the 18th century, when increasing numbers of professional battalions were raised. This gentleman of German stock commanded his Norwegian recruits, using his native tongue.
Kept up. Offensive on now.
By the end of the 17th century, there were about 15,000 Norwegian troops. By the mid-18th century, that number had swelled to an upwards of 30,000. The tax burdens were heavy. Regular service was tough, thankless work, endless drills, voyages, diseases, and uncertainties that took many a lad away from seeing his farm ever again. The Great Nordic War would be a baptism of fire for the navy and army. Peter Wessel Tordenskjold, a native Norwegian, became a rallying figure of national pride. His naval victory at Dynekilden was an important factor in turning the invading forces of Charles XII back. Norway once again had taken many losses for the crown, but had successfully resisted the invaders. Charles XII died and peace broke out for Denmark-Norway, an 80-year period of armed neutrality. Revolts and popular dissent were rarely, if ever, directed towards the king, although who really knows what people thought? The records show us complaints, often over corrupt officials or unreasonable tax burdens. Strilekrigen in Bergen, 1765, was a tax revolt. The tax collector Ulrik Frédéric de Cessignon woke up to a mob of thousands of angry farmers. The Danish state often strived to appear generous, whilst quietly going after the leaders. Christian Jensen Loftus was one of those. He would sow dissent in the southern towns of Norway over restrictive trade policies. Christian was arrested in 1787. He died in chains here at Akershus fortress. The biggest threat to the establishment came from a religious figure, Hans Nielsen Hauge. He was a traveling minister who had little designs on political power, but for preaching a version of Protestantism that valued a personal connection with God, entrepreneurial self-sufficiency, and personal sacrifice, he was continually persecuted. Meanwhile, liberal and patriotic ideas entered the minds of upper-class writers and intellectuals. Who had studied abroad and observed the impact of the French and American revolutions. Many writers were sympathetic to the revolutionaries, although they were heavily censored in the Danish press. Still, by the end of the 18th century, the king's ministers sought to liberalize trade and press freedom all over the realm. Traveller and visitor to Norway, Mary Wollstonecraft, commented on the relative freedoms enjoyed by most Norwegians.
Though the King of Denmark be an absolute monarch, yet the Norwegians appear to enjoy all the blessings of freedom. Norway may be termed a sister kingdom, but the people have no viceroy to lord it over them, and fatten his dependents with the fruit of their labour.
Merchant Jacob Aall would also later write, "Nowhere were the effects of the French Revolution felt less than in Norway, and nowhere did ideas of liberty cause less ferment. There was no wish for any change, and the great mass of the inhabitants had long enjoyed in effect that freedom and equality in the conditions of civil life, in which other nations waged a bloody struggle to win." Things were going well, so what went wrong? A crisis came at the worst possible junction for the king and his regent crown prince. As the Napoleonic Wars raged throughout Europe, the British, in a preemptive strike, sieged Copenhagen and robbed the realm of its entire fleet, forcing Denmark-Norway into a costly war on the side of Napoleon, which it was doomed to lose. Under the British blockade, Denmark was unable to supply Norway with its regular shipments of grain. The tax burdens were already heavy, hunger and famine set in, and now there was yet again a border war with Sweden. There was much tension in the upper tiers of society too. The officials and the patriciate demanded the forming of their own national institutions. The king in Copenhagen seemed increasingly out of touch with his own people, even ceding Norway to Sweden as some piece of property. An argument could be made. He no longer had a people. And so, farmers, officials, merchants, people and representatives of the entire country decided to convene here at Eidsvoll to sit down and decide the future and outcome of their own country. Debates were held, flaming speeches, bitter disagreements over whether Norway should join Sweden or not. Many liters of wine and liquor were drunk into the small hours, poring over a constitutional draft, with a small cup of coffee for the eventual hangover. The authors of the original constitution didn't reject monarchy, but the writers were inspired by French and American constitutions, liberal ideals, and they were keen to avoid the return of the ways of the old absolutist king. The young Oldenburg crown prince and stadtholder of Norway, Christian Fredrik, became a rallying figure for independence as he led the resistance against Sweden, becoming the first king of a newly independent Norway. And who knows what sort of country Norway would have turned out to be in the 19th century if the new king of Norway hadn't lost that war. But this is also where the centuries-long twinship with Denmark irreversibly and abruptly ends. The rest is history as Norway prepared for union with Sweden. 19th century writer and poet Henrik Wergeland would give his own bitter assessment of the period during which Norway and Denmark were joined. Our Norway and medieval Norway of history seems like two broken off pieces that are joined together in the middle by a false period that we had to break off in order to reveal its true nature. The 19th century historian Ernst Sars identified Norway's free farmers as a source of democracy and argued that Norway had retained its national character under Denmark. Historian Jens Astrup Seip furthermore added that the Norwegian aristocracy of officials were vital to the path to Norwegian independence. But as the tree of Norway grew its own separate ways, intellectuals began framing the existence under Denmark as that of a colony. Although this may be true, it is important to note how the Norwegians eventually participated in this regime and the colonization of other lands, and profited from it. I started this film exploring the squashed revolt of Telemark in 1540, and I ended up here in Eidsvoll in 1814. Many generations later, where the people of the country were much more resourceful, united, and able to stand up for themselves. Everywhere I went on this journey, I found that the kings have left their marks, not only in terms of statues and monograms, but in entire towns, in landscapes and industries. Now, I don't have much wisdom to part with, but I would argue that there are many questions about the role of a ruler, a people, and how patriotism, democracy, and self-determinism evolves that this period can answer. So, if we are to understand our own fragile democracies today, and yes, our way of thinking about ourselves, we simply have to study and understand this period much better. Skål, cheers. Until next time, adieu.